what we'll find throughout the series, and just as you read the news critically these days, that line between what's domestic and what's foreign is increasingly blurred. So each of these issues has a very real Wisconsin connection and Wisconsin impact.
Well, my task, as it has been given to me by Doug and the Institute, is to provide the framework for a discussion of policy choices and issues that face us as a country in the areas of immigration and immigration policy. So I'm going to do that by trying to lay out what I think are the essential facts that need to inform any real debate and need to inform any real policy if it is going to be workable. And those facts fall into 7 groups. First set of facts, of course, has to do with something that's familiar to all of us, and that is that we are a nation of immigrants. That nation of immigrants story about ourselves has always been the case. It is certainly alive and well, but even though immigration has taken place throughout our history, in fact, large-scale immigration, our real major periods of immigration, have only been 4. And those periods of immigration in our history began, of course, with the peopling of the country and included the only real forced migration, which was when slaves were brought to this country. The second major large-scale immigration occurred in the middle 1800s and coincided with the opening up of the West. The third large-scale period of immigration followed the Civil War and went up until the First World War, and that's, of course, the period of immigration that coincided with the industrialization of the country, with the large cities of the Northeast having been formed. And then there's the fourth period of large-scale peak immigration. And that's the period that we are living in or have been living in since about 1970. So large-scale immigrations tend to be stimulated by major economic transformations. They also help the country and an economy absorb some of the harshest effects of economic transformation. In that way, this peak period is similar to what we've experienced before as a country. This peak period, though, is also somewhat dissimilar, and it's dissimilar in a couple of key ways that are important for what it is that we do about policy. Those earlier periods of peak immigration happened when we did not have immigration laws that had any numerical ceilings. So this peak immigration is the first time that we've been through a real rise connected to economic transformation, where there in fact are laws in place that limit the numbers of people who come. And so what we see today as compared with earlier periods is that we have with our immigration a large-scale illegal immigration accompanying the legal immigration that takes place. And that, of course, is a circumstance where we've had more job demand and more people coming than the number of visas that are available in our immigration laws at the present time. Second has to do with demography. Demography, of course, the key issue with our demography is that we are an aging society. We are an aging society for the first time in our history, and that means for immigration purposes that we're no longer producing enough younger workers from our native-born population for the numbers of jobs that this economy has generated. What is happening then is that with aging and with the retirement of the baby boomers, combined, of course, with low fertility rates, our workers and our workers for new jobs have been coming primarily from 2 sources: older workers and foreign-born workers. Now, older workers is an important phenomenon, particularly in light of the recession. More older people will be working longer, and will be staying in the labor market. There's no question about that. But at the same time, there are jobs and there are needs in the labor market that are not able to be met by untapped domestic sources. And those needs have been being met by foreign-born workers. So, as a country, population, our foreign-born population in this country now is 12.9% of the population. That is quite high. It is not the highest that we've ever been. We were at about 14% foreign-born at the turn of the century, 1900 to about the First World War. But it is high and it is large numbers. And by the way, just to get into perspective where Wisconsin fits in all of that, the national average of foreign-born is 12.9%. Wisconsin, it's 4.5%. So Wisconsin is very far down on the list. For Wisconsin, it's 38th out of 50 states in terms of the number of foreign-born people that live in Wisconsin. But for the rest of the country, 12.9% is the overall average. 12.9% is the average of the population, but of the workforce, nearly 16% of the workers in our workforce are foreign-born. 1 in 6 workers are foreign-born, but 1 in 2 new workers are foreign-born. So that's the best way I can try to kind of nail what this demographic change means in terms of aging and the workforce and changes in the workforce. Let me take you third now to the issues of skills and the skills question of what it is that these foreign-born workers in fact do. Well, typically we describe immigration as an hourglass, which is that you have the high end, then you have the middle of the hour, and then you have the low end. Foreign-born workers tend to be concentrated at the high end and at the low end. They tend to meet needs and gaps in those very different parts of the labor market. So in the low end, what you find is that we are now a country where almost 90% of our native-born population gets at least a high school education. That is a real change in a century. 100 years ago, 10% of native-born Americans had a high school education. But it's now 90%. However, a lot of the job creation that was taking place in this economy prior to the recession was in less than high school required jobs. So in the low-skilled sectors of the labor market, you did not have enough native-born workers who aspired to jobs that required less than a high school education. So there's the mismatch that leads to the concentration of foreign-born workers in low-skilled parts of the labor market. In the high-skilled, it's a very different story. Foreign-born workers tend to concentrate in the science, math, engineering fields, which are essential for a high-technology economy, but which native-born young people don't like to go into. And so in the fields of science and math, in order for us to maintain our technology leadership, in order for us to continue to be innovative, and we've been very, very successful as a society in those realms, the foreign-born bring and meet the skill needs in those fields that require math, science, and engineering. There are lots and lots of examples of this. You look at the startups, you look at the patents, you look at Silicon Valley companies dominated by foreign-born founders, inventors, innovators, so that although we certainly need to do better as a society in getting American-born kids to go into these fields, and I just noticed on the airplane this morning coming in that there was a big event at the White House today that apparently President Obama is launching an initiative to train 100,000 teachers in science and math in order to upgrade science and math skills in American-born workers. So that's, of course, these are very important steps that need to be taken. So the hourglass picture really is one of complements to the labor market rather than competition in the labor market. Okay, the fourth set of issues. The fourth set of issues has to do with wages and the economic effects of immigration. Now this, of course, is the issue that is one of the issues that is most deeply felt by the American public and the most worrying to people, which is that foreign-born workers take our jobs, replace us, and make it not be possible for us to move forward, American-born workers, in the labor market and lower wages. Well, it is certainly true in economic theory and in experience that large influxes of new workers drive down wages. But at the same time, large influxes of new workers stimulate growth, which was very much the case in the 1990s and the early 2000s. They create new consumers, they create entrepreneurs, they create investors. So what's the balance here? What is really taking place? Well, probably what's really taking place is that the vast majority of American workers are not hurt in their wages and in their job prospects by foreign-born workers in the way that they have in this hourglass way. And in fact, American workers' wages probably are higher to some degree because of immigration, just because of the overall productivity of the economy. Where there is competition, and there definitely is some competition in that band of high school educated or not high school educated native born. But overall, for each job that an immigrant fills, an additional American job is created. And so the availability of foreign-born workers does make it possible for employers to expand more quickly. It also puts the foreign-born workers at a bigger disadvantage because when there are contractions in the economy, they are the ones that are the most vulnerable the most quickly. They're the first fired, and they, in the recession, since the recession, have suffered higher degrees of job loss, and that's particularly the case because the recession has hit so hard in some of the industries that were very saturated with immigrant workers. Most importantly, construction and the housing industry, which of course is the core reason of the recession, and also in personal services, hospitality industries that also have suffered as a result of the recession. So where wages and economic effects are concerned, the picture is one of macro pluses for the macro economy, contributions that immigrants make, particularly at the federal level through taxes, paying Social Security. Immigration adds up to a net plus for the economy, but there are those areas of negative that I mentioned where the competition with less than high school educated American workers are concerned. There is this whole issue of our laws and of our legal immigration system. So when you look at immigration through the lens of what our laws allow for, you of course have this legal system which brings in about 1.1 million people a year. It's a very large flow of people that come here through the legal system. But at the same time, you have substantial illegal immigration that has been taking place during this peak immigration period of the last 40 years. And those illegal immigrants are typically in the public mind people that have come across the southwest border with Mexico illegally, and they, of course, are the predominant group of illegal immigrants, and the predominant nationality of illegal immigrants is Mexican. But you also have a large share of the illegal immigrant population that is here because they came properly with visas and then overstayed those visas. And that proportion is somewhere between 40 and 50%. So we are not talking about a footnote. The illegal population is a combination of southwest border crossers and people who are visa overstayers. We have about 40 million foreign-born people in our country at this time. That's the 12.9%. If you divide them up roughly, they fall into three groups. About a third of that foreign-born population are naturalized citizens. About a third of our foreign-born population have green cards, or what's called in the law lawful permanent residence, so they are lawfully here. But the other third of that foreign-born population are the unauthorized population. And that unauthorized population now consists of about 11 to 12 million people. And the reason for it is that we've gone through this long period where our law and our economy is disconnected. So you simply haven't had enough visas in the system to meet the labor market needs as they have occurred. That recipe is the recipe that explains this sizable illegal population, illegal immigrant population that we have in the country. The sixth set of ideas has to do with what we and demographers who work on these issues call the new growth states phenomenon. Immigration has basically been a phenomenon of destination states that are New York, New Jersey, we could all recite them, Florida, Illinois, Texas, and California. Those states have always experienced immigration. They are accustomed to dealing with immigration. They have always complained about immigration also because they haven't thought that the federal government does enough for them, etc. But they've been in the game. Much more recently, that picture has changed. So that what you have is states like this, and some of them will ring a bell to you in terms of what it is that's happening in those states. The state with the highest rate of change growth in foreign-born population is Alabama, 92%. Next comes South Carolina, 88%. Tennessee, 81%. Arkansas, 78%. Kentucky, 75%. These are enormously fast rates of growth in foreign-born population where they did not exist before. It's the rapidity of the change and the social awareness and the social change that goes with that that has created an enormous amount of frustration and anger and uncertainty. And of course, it's underscored by the fact that the predominant characteristic of those populations going into those new growth states is that they are illegal immigrants rather than legal immigrants. And so you have the social reaction of states that are not equipped to deal with it. They don't have the language capability that New York and Chicago have. They don't have in their court systems the interpreters that you need in order to, they don't have in their law enforcement systems people that are trained to deal in cross-cultural kinds of issues. And that, of course, and they have also not been prepared to deal with the schools, education, the healthcare issues, hospitals, translation, etc. And that has led to a real cauldron of anger and frustration. Now, at the same time, this same immigration has been a lifeline for these states because these states are the states in the country that have been losing population. They've been losing population not only because of aging and demography, they've been losing population because of the coastal phenomenon of people growing up in the middle of the country and leaving and going to each of the coasts. So that you have foreign-born populations coming in often to rural areas, often to small towns and communities, and you see that nearby here. I mean, 40% of the dairy farm workforce in Wisconsin is Mexican-born. Meatpacking plants in Iowa have revived communities in Iowa that would have disappeared by now, and that's the case in Nebraska and in Kansas and in other places as well. So you have this economic and demographic lifeline, but you have the social change that comes with it that people have not been prepared for and are very angry about. In some of these circumstances, taking measures into their own hands because they see a vacuum of policy at the federal level they need to respond to, or they believe they need to respond to the frustration of their own populations, and so they have passed laws, often very, very harsh laws. Finally, last issue. Last issue has to do with immigrant integration, the integration of immigrants into our society. Because ultimately, the test of a successful immigration policy is people becoming part of the American fabric. We used to call this assimilation. Nowadays, we tend more to call it immigrant integration. But it is, of course, what the United States has been as successful at as any nation in the world, and many would argue we have been more successful at it than any nation in the world, even other immigrant nations. Immigrant integration basically takes place at the local level. It takes place through families, through schools, through churches, through nationality networks, and it takes place by strong institutions in the society kind of kicking in and dealing with newcomers. And those are the kinds of institutions that we are proud of as a society. Strong public education systems, in an industrial age, strong unions that brought about labor protections for workers, anti-discrimination laws and policies. So in that way, we are different from any other immigration nation in the world, because most other immigration nations, in fact, have elaborate federal programs for support of immigrant integration. We do not. We have always looked to our established institutions, core driven by family and family connections, to bring about integration. And that has been a very successful recipe in the past. But we're facing some real challenges today in whether that model can continue to serve us well in the way that it has in the past. Largely, that rests on the way in which the economy has changed, because in the past, it has been possible to get upward mobility in one generation by being part of an industrial economy where, with less than a high school education, you could work in a factory or in a trade and earn the kind of a wage that puts you into the middle class in one generation. That is less and less the case in today's economy. In today's economy, education is far more important for the kinds of jobs that pay the kinds of wages that creates that mobility. And so that bridge is weaker. And in addition, the public education piece and the organized labor piece are not what they were in past high peak periods of immigration. So the standards that we need to meet are higher. You need more education than you used to in order to succeed, and the bridges to getting to that place are more frayed than they were in the past. But it is essential that we succeed at this immigrant integration enterprise, because the people that we are talking about are our future workforce. This is an absolutely quintessential they is us sort of a circumstance. And I'm going to give you some numbers again here. 24% of the children in our country today have at least one foreign-born parent. 30% of the children who are low income have at least one foreign-born parent. So when you look at numbers like that, and these are by and large American-born children, foreign-born parents, they have to get the kind of an education that will make it possible for us to continue to succeed as an economy. And so that puts a premium on education. The most important element of that education, of course, is English language, and the other most important element of that education is at least high school graduation, if not more. So that is our challenge where immigrant integration is concerned. All right, now let me try to wrap this together and then make a few closing observations. To wrap it together, the top line lessons are immigration is changing us. It's changing us quite dramatically as a society. And in the process, it's really nothing less than reinventing ourselves. We really are reinventing ourselves as we have in the past in our history. That reinventing is an enormous source of economic productivity. It is, in the future, going to be and is already serving as a demographic lifeline, even with the recession. But it is critically in our national interest to do this right, and the way we're doing it right now is not doing it right. It's a broken system. Why is it a broken system? Well, basically it's a broken system because it does not allow at the present time enough visas, enough opportunity for people to come to the United States for work purposes. And if there's any one thing that I hope you will take home with you that is incredibly misunderstood, it is this notion that, oh, if they only had come legally, it would be okay. And we're hearing it now in the campaign, get to the back of the line. There is no line. The point is that for legal immigration, the access for work purposes is somewhat there for high-skilled, not enough, but it is really not there for low-skilled, and low-skilled is part of the picture where our economy is concerned. So that's the brokenness of the system. We're running a system that is disconnected in these ways and that basically is dysfunctional, and it's really indefensible and sinister as a way to go forward into the future and to perpetuate. The solutions, of course, require legislation, and the reason we haven't been able to get legislation goes really to the bigger problem that we have as a country, and that is that our political system is stalemated. It's in a paralysis, and this is an issue that is a victim of that paralysis because this is an issue that cannot be addressed without a strong bipartisan center.
I run the energy and environment team at CAP, and as such do a lot of work on federal policy in particular, and really on this issue of sort of what kind of economy do we want to have, what kind of energy economy in particular. Do we want to sort of go down this sort of status quo path, or do we want to get to a more diversified and more, I think, more competitive economy? So in preparing for this trip, I kind of went back and did a bunch of research on Wisconsin to see where is this state when it comes to sort of which path we're taking. And you know a lot of these things already, but I always think it's striking. Almost 100% of the power in the state is imported from other places. It's almost entirely from fossil fuel sources. So you know these numbers, I'm sure, but about 30% from coal, almost 30% from petroleum, interestingly, a lot of natural gas, some nuclear, a little bit of renewables, about 4.5% renewables. Everything but the renewable piece of that is imported from other places. The state spends about $12 billion a year importing all that energy. So that's a little bit, you know, stark. So there's a question sort of, do you want to stay on that path? Now, there is some renewable innovation going on. There's some interesting innovation and new research, particularly at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There's a new research center being built. A lot of work has been done in the last 10 years or so on biomass in particular. The state is, although this is never like the most exciting sounding thing about this state is very good at biomass waste. So there's a lot of farm waste, there's a lot of forest waste, there's a lot of cow waste, there's a lot of municipal waste. All that waste can be harnessed and turned into energy, and it's something the state's competitive in. You've got obviously the Glacier Hills Wind Project, which is a great project to look at because most of the manufacturing and the construction labor was domestic. So there's things happening. I mean, I think there's 135, I found, solar and 171 wind manufacturing firms in the state. 12,000 jobs in the renewable energy sector in the state. So there's, it's not like nothing is happening, but you still have this imported energy issue, and you still have political challenges. So the energy strategy includes things like deciding to switch the Madison plant instead of from coal to biomass to natural gas. That's a strategy. The strategy includes massively exporting sand to use in natural gas fracking process in other states. The strategy includes, it is a strategy not to move forward with renewables. So you've got a sort of a Wisconsin governor legislature that's sort of focused on, I would say, the status quo path, but a lot of potential to move on to another path. So these are really different kinds of economic growth models, and I come from an economic development background, so I tend to think of energy in an economic development context, sort of how do we look at the state, what are our strengths, how do we leverage the strengths, where do we want to go with that, what's our economic and energy future. In some ways, the questions that are happening here in Wisconsin are sort of a microcosm of the United States. So globally, on the positive side, the United States is now the global leader in clean energy. We are the world's largest investor in clean energy. But we're leaders primarily because we spent 2 or 3 years living off of the single largest domestic spending bill for clean energy in the history of the country, which was the stimulus bill. And that's coming to an end. We're starting to see a decline in investment. And at the same time, we have a federal legislature that's committed to keeping us on a fossil fuel path. To me, this really points to us being at a kind of a stark moment in terms of our choice on energy. We're at a place where we have to make a choice between an energy path that's a very well-defined energy path. It's being laid out for us every day by the American Petroleum Institute. It is a path where we drill offshore, drill onshore in the whole Atlantic coast, drill onshore, drill in the Arctic, exploit the Marcellus Shale and the other natural gas formations, exploit oil shale, and build the Keystone Pipeline. So that is a vision. That is a vision for the United States. And you will hear very compelling arguments about that being a way for us to do domestic production to get us off of foreign oil. The alternative vision, and one that obviously we talk about a lot at CAP, is a vision that's more diversified, where there's more energy choice, where, yes, we can't get off fossil fuels tomorrow. This is a big part of our energy mix, but where we're starting to move much more aggressively into renewables, we're doing much more efficiency, we're doing much more innovation around alternatives, and we're trying to build an economy and an export economy that's based on being leaders in that clean energy. So it's really an extraction economy and an innovation economy. But if you add in things like environmental impact and global warming and the quality of jobs and America as a global leader and competitor, you actually end up very much on the side, I think, of a clean energy path. So let's take as an assumption that we want to go that way, that we sort of want to choose the alternative energy path. What's the role of the government or the public sector in getting us there? Does the public sector have a role? Taking a step back, what's the role of the public sector in general? We have, in general, in this country, been very comfortable with the public sector having a large role sort of at the beginning of the value chain. So let's say that you kind of start, and I'll do it from your direction. You start over here with early stage research and development. You invent an idea. You're at a lab, you're at a university, you invent something. Moving into commercialization, and then you move into manufacturing and mass manufacturing. Installation, let's say with big systems, operating and maintenance. It's kind of the path of a technology. We've always been very comfortable with government intervention over here. Early stage R&D, very bipartisan still, even in Washington, where nothing is bipartisan. Early stage R&D is bipartisan. The federal labs don't get their budgets cut very much. We get less and less comfortable as you go over here because the market is supposed to take over more and more of a role, right? The closer you go to the market and commercialization, the more market takes over. The problem is with that model is that there are areas in which there are market failures and the market doesn't take over. And there are areas in which the public interest dictates that we should have a role and take over and help the market where there's market failure. So examples of market failures, which are rife in the clean energy context. Your externalities of your technology are not being capitalized. So you have a coal plant. So the coal plant is way past early stage R&D, but let's say you have a coal plant and it's going along and it's market ready and the utilities want to pay for it and they pass through the cost to the ratepayers and it's all taken care of by the market. But the cost that you as a ratepayer are paying for that coal doesn't take into account the health impacts on your community, doesn't take into account carbon pollution, doesn't take into account potential impact on global warming. If it did, it would be much more expensive. If it did, the market would probably say, coal is actually not cheaper than renewables, we should take a second look at renewables. Even if you didn't have all this market failures, you have the fact that fossil fuels, by and large, have climate impacts, have health impacts, have environmental impacts. And then I would argue that staying on a sort of an extractive and fossil fuel economic model is not good for us in terms of our long-term economic future and competitiveness. So we have a national interest in going the other direction. Let's assume that. What role should government have in that, and should government sort of take over? No, no one is arguing that. Even if you have government intervention in the form of, say, a renewable energy standard, which is a government intervention. We have one in Wisconsin. It says 10% of the power in the state sold by utilities has to come from renewable sources. We have no national energy standard like that, but 30 states have those standards. That's a government intervention. Or you could have the production tax credit for wind that helps people put up wind farms. That's a government intervention. Or the much discussed Department of Energy loan guarantee program, which none of you had ever heard of, I guarantee, until a year ago. And then when the Solyndra thing happened, now you all know what it is. The Department of Energy loan guarantee program that funded Solyndra is a government intervention. Those are not intended to take over the market. We are not a country that, except for in the Defense Department, we're not a country that sort of takes over a market and fully funds it. What those are intended to do is to send a market signal that something is a good investment for the private sector. And all of those things I just mentioned have driven private investment. And it has, in fact, worked in the green energy sector. States like Michigan, well, actually overall, during the depth of the recession, the only industries that significantly grew jobs during the recession were clean energy industries. So whereas the economy as a whole grew at a very, very sluggish rate in the depth of the recession, green energy industries grew at about 8.3% at the same time. So this is actually a bright spot in our economy, despite what you might have been hearing. So we'd argue, there's a public interest in funding these programs. There is there's a market failure. There's a need for the government to be involved in some way. Another important point is that, and this gets to the foreign policy part of this conversation, is that other countries are investing in these industries. It's not as if we're making a decision as a country whether or not to get involved in clean energy, and if we don't invest in it, it's going away. So if we don't invest in clean energy industries, they fail, right? The rest of the world is taking this bet. The rest of the world is already moving ahead. China has doubled the installation of renewable energy to the United States. China makes 50% of all wind and solar components in the world, which is just amazing, right? I mean, and you talk about China 3 years ago and that wasn't true. This is huge. China is trying very hard to move into the innovation side of the clean energy economy where we've traditionally been leaders. Germany has, the EU as a whole has passed comprehensive policies to push clean energy, and Germany has become a world leader in solar. You've all heard this. Germany doesn't have that much sun, but they're a world leader in solar because they made a decision to invest in the technology. Germany and China and the EU in general and China are interesting because what they've done, how they got to where they are, is not because the magic of the market worked differently. It was because both places have comprehensive public policy strategies to make this happen. So what China does is says, we will pass a law about carbon emissions from autos. That will lead people to want to buy lower carbon vehicles. At the same time, we will invest in low carbon vehicle manufacturing and in workforce training for people to make low carbon vehicles. We'll use our market as the first primary market to sell into, and then we'll export to the rest of the world. And that sounds very command and control and top down, but Germany does something very similar. Combines targets with a targeted manufacturing and workforce strategy, a domestic demand strategy, and then turns it into an export strategy. Here in the United States, we call that picking winners and losers, and we don't do it. At the federal level, or we say we don't do it. We do it in a couple of very key places, which are, interestingly, the leaders in clean energy innovation. One of them is the Department of Defense. So the DoD is a great example. DoD has kind of looked at this problem worldwide and said, we have a huge national security problem if we don't do something about our energy system. We have a failing power grid here in the United States. If that grid gets attacked, that's very centralized, very few power stations. If those get attacked and we have blackouts on our bases, that's a national security problem. So the Department of Defense is the world leader now in investing in new innovations in microgrid technology. So individual small grids for smaller sort of community scale grids, they're doing them on their bases. They're trying to get their bases to be net zero energy users. They're using the land around their bases, a lot of which is used for military exercises, but not all, for renewable energy installations and for test beds for the private sector to try out new technologies. So the military is really going ahead on this. And I think that's significant because first, we like the military and we think they're probably smart about security threats. But second, because they are in fact picking winners and losers, but they're doing it with a very specific sort of public interest in mind, and they're doing it in a place where the market isn't adjusting. And I think that's important when we sort of think about what the government role is. Where are we now? Sort of what's the hope for how to move forward on this stuff? Representative Henry Waxman, who used to be the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and you may know if you follow carbon legislation, was one of the authors of the Waxman-Markey bill, which was the cap and trade bill that did not pass out of Congress a couple years ago. Waxman came to speak at my organization, and one of the things he said really resonated with me. He said, I've been in Congress 30 years, and I have never seen before a situation where energy is completely moved from being a regional issue to a partisan issue. He sort of said, the minute you talk about energy or clean energy, it's become a partisan conversation. We are a complete stalemate in Washington on this stuff. It's almost impossible to talk about it. Legislatively, I'm afraid we're looking at a pretty tough year. Again, we have things that are bipartisan, like early stage research and development, but even those things are getting hard to get out the door in this current Congress. But that's not to say that people aren't trying. States and cities are really trying to make up for the lack of federal leadership and move forward in areas, and in some ways it's easier at the local, not easier, but it makes sense at the local level because people sort of, at the federal level, this is all a big macroeconomic conversation that doesn't feel like it touches people. At the local level, you're talking about people's actual energy bills. You're talking about where does their power come from. You're talking about, do they have a choice this summer when gas prices go over $4 a gallon for more than 2 months, which they're expected to do. So at the local level, I think that you can really have a conversation about choice and energy diversity and sort of bringing these things back to people and bringing, honestly, where I think we need to go, bringing energy back away from that partisan scale, back to being a regional and a local issue, back into the hands of people where they live, and really kind of doing classic economic development again and saying, what are we good at in Wisconsin, right? We're good at these things. We have these natural resources. We're good at these things. We can leverage those and we can be leaders. In this part of the country and other parts of the country, we can be leaders across the clean energy economy. We don't need to go back to an old model of economic growth where we dig up our land and sell the stuff that's underneath it. We actually have another choice. So with that, I will leave you and go up to the conversation. Thank you.
So how do we get to the point where we're talking about grant strategy? Grant strategy, I was down and doing work for Special Operations Command, doing strategy for Special Ops, and in the process of trying to craft a strategy for Special Operations, we came into the conclusion that we didn't have a grant strategy. It was hard to contextualize what special ops guys are supposed to go out there and do out in the world if we don't have what's this nation about? My decision calculus, my litmus test on what would be effective was Mom and Dad Mykleby in Wayzata, Minnesota. If the words that we could put out there would resonate with them and have some kind of visceral meaning to them and actually address the realities that we face as Americans in a globalized, interconnected, interdependent, hyper-transparent world, well, then maybe we were onto something. So we didn't propose that we were going to have all the answers. We were just going to propose perhaps a story, a narrative, a national strategic narrative that would talk about more about the realities that we face, yes, but talk less about all the things that we were against as Americans and start talking about the things that we were for. Instead of being wedded to this absolutely masochistic, nostalgic view to the past and about what was being taken away from us and what we don't have and what, you know, China's rising, Iran's bad, yuckity yuck, we're talking about what are we for? What could we be in the 21st century? What are the touchstones of being Americans? And where is the strength that we need to garner to be the best America? Because I'm telling you right now, the world needs America to be its best. In the introduction of Common Sense, this is what Thomas Paine said. He said that the cause of America is in a large measure the cause of mankind. So what is our cause in the 21st century? And so just to get to the point, I mean, when we looked out the window, what did we see? Well, we saw an America not in decline, but definitely America stuck in a status quo. And that really got us thinking. Because back in 1946, when George Kennan was sitting down in the basement of the embassy in Moscow and he's gagging out the long telegram, you know, thinking about the Soviet Union, and he kind of came up, while he didn't overtly label it containment at the time, he did offer that concept of containment. It was later more formally articulated in the Sources of Soviet Conduct in the article of Foreign Affairs in 1947, his X article. He really laid out the conceptual framework for where our nation was going to go in the future, in that context, at that given time. And it was absolutely the right thing to do. Containment was designed around a framework of control, a strategy of control. And back during the Cold War, we could have that framework of control, where we could, because just the nature of information, control how people viewed things and how we were going to implement things. It worked, all right? But when the Soviet Union collapsed, we never did a big reset, and we never recognized exactly where we stood and what our role was, what was the cause of America going into the 21st century. And that's the thing that Wayne and I focused on. Because the strategies of control are no longer pertinent. Strategies of control, you cannot control dynamics. This is Stoic philosophy on steroids. Anybody read Epictetus, maybe, perchance? Epictetus, the big Stoic philosopher? I mean, the basic concept of Stoic philosophy is if you try to control the uncontrollable, you're going to be a miserable you-know-what. So control what you can control and be the best contributing member of a society that you could possibly be. And that's where we started looking at things in a different light. Instead of a closed system based around control, which the strategy of containment was, and the structures of National Security Act of 1947 delivered to us, we started thinking in terms of open systems. And in that open system, we started thinking in ecological terms. We started thinking about in a systemic fashion rather than a systematic fashion. We started thinking about the interconnections of all these different systems, not only within our nation, but also on a global scale. That these interdependencies that we have, not only in our economic systems, our political systems, but also in our social systems and our moral systems as human beings, we've arrived there. And there's no going back. And I know everyone thinks that's going to be a very dangerous talk, interdependencies, that's bad. Well, no. That's the paradox of resilience, is that in deeper, more meaningful interdependencies, we actually have greater strength. That's the perspective we looked at it. We looked at it from in ecological terms. And that's what led us to, can we move from a strategy of containment to a strategy of sustainability? Sustainability, the ecological concept of sustainability being an organism's ability to remain diverse and productive over time. Interesting definition. I mean, that's just a science definition. Right? And I should have said back there before, and I know there's a certain amount of that there's a global conspiracy around sustainability. Well, I'm here to tell you that if a Marine colonel who dedicated his life 28 years in uniform to the security of this nation, I'm here to tell you there's no stinking global conspiracy around sustainability. Right? It was just us looking out the window and saying what's going to be needed going forward, because it's not lost on me that as a human race we're consuming 1.5 planets worth of resources. Now, I wasn't very good at math, but that math doesn't make sense to me, because you only got one planet. We've got a resource-constrained environment. The math doesn't work out. And oh, by the way, if everyone consumed at the rate that America consumed at right now, we'd need 4.5 planets worth of resources. That's just math. It's not ideology, it's not the religion, it's nothing else. It's other than just stinking math. And that's of strategic concern to me anyways, not just because I'm a Marine, but also because I'm a dad. So, stepping back to the concept of sustainability, an organism's ability to remain diverse and productive over time. Diverse, depth, resiliency, our ability to take a gut punch at a national scale. All right? We don't have that right now. We have very brittle, linear systems. It's not lost on me that it takes 10 to 14 calories of petroleum energy to get 1 calorie of food in your belly. That's an unsustainable system. The math doesn't work out, period. So let's go off that one. So let's get over to the aspect of being productive as an organism. When you're looking at being productive as an organism, that means your ability to prosper, the ability to grow, growth. But we tend to only view growth today in only quantitative terms. We're not considering the ability to grow in qualitatively. So now we have people that we have 1/3 of our nation is clinically obese. We spend $174 billion a year on diabetes, $116 billion a year in direct medical treatments, $58 billion in ancillary costs and lost productivity and lost work time. We've got increasing rates of asthma. We've got people that we're losing pace in the education realm. So our mental health, our mental condition, our physical health, our physical condition is waning. When are we going to wake up and smell the coffee and say, maybe this is the time for a shift? The math isn't working out. And oh, by the way, 50% of Iowa's topsoil is gone. 50%. Now, I'm not smart, but I can do math, kind of. 50%, that's a lot. That's a lot of dirt that's gone. That's a self-inflicted wound because we've chosen, there was a certain policy decision made in 1972 by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, and we were going to go to the big agribusiness model. Now, I'm a Minnesota guy. We actually had a family farm, and I know a little thing or two about corn. We can no longer continue at this pace because eventually Mother Earth has this nasty habit of kicking us to the curb when we piss her off too much. Just to ask the cod industry. We've already got plenty of models, systemic collapse in ecological systems when we push it too far. At what point are we going to recognize that the ability just to grow food, one of the most basic things that human beings have to do, our nation's ability to grow food, and oh, by the way, feed the world. We're through 7 billion, we got another 2 billion people to incorporate into the world. And we feed a lot of them. When are we going to get to the point where we recognize that the way we're farming right now is not sustainable? It's not sustainable. I mean, it's just a word. It's not a poisonous word. It's just the reality. It's based on science. It's based on math. And it's based on a strategic imperative that we've got to come to grips with. Sustainability needs to become our national strategic imperative for the 21st century because the math isn't working out the way we currently are. So what does that all mean? When we framed all this out, when we came to this epiphany that we have to take an ecological approach, we have to think in terms of ecological systems. We have to think systemically about grand strategy for the United States and all the systems that incorporate that. Beyond national security just meaning defense. The national security isn't just defense. It's just not about our shores outward, that it's about the integrating our systems that are so critical and vital to the human condition here in our own nation, as well as those around the world. We have to start thinking in those in an integrative design fashion. So what did that mean for us in terms of framing out a grand strategy for the United States? Well, we said, well, if we could have sustainability become the national strategic imperative of our nation, well, now we can start doing things like converging foreign and domestic policies towards a common end, kind of like we used to around containment days. Instead of having this either-or manichaeistic binary choice between foreign and domestic policies, we need to converge them. Converge them around the concept of sustainability. And in the framework of doing that, that means smart power abroad, the Joseph Nye concept, and smart growth at home, if we want to frame those out. And what does that mean? It means if we're doing smart power abroad and smart growth at home, that means that the way we live our lives, if we could close this say-do gap, we say one thing, but we do another thing. And if you don't think the world's listening, they are. I got plenty of examples of being out and about doing weird stuff over the past 28 years that will tell you that it got me convinced that as the day is long. But smart growth at home can be our exportable model about what it's going to take in a 21st century context as a human condition in order to thrive. And that's what puts us back in a place of leadership. By building our strength at home, we can have the credibility and influence abroad. And it's not a control thing, and it's not being able to dictate our terms, because I'm talking about influence the noun, not influence the verb. It's the way we live our life at home is going to dictate our relationships abroad. Smart growth at home means smart power abroad. When we start showing how to play the game and doing the game, then we're going to have that credibility and influence to address our enduring national interests of prosperity and security over the long haul. And, oh, by the way, we're going to do it in a values-based way. So we don't have to make the false choices of kicking the door in on somebody because they piss us off. Now, we may still have to do that. I'm not talking about getting rid of the military, because I'm all about a strong military. All right? But we have to put it in perspective, because if all we do is lead with a military chin, guess what? We become the land of threat and risk, and we're no longer the land of opportunity. And let me just tell you a quick story. In 2007, I was in West Africa in Mali, doing some stuff north of the Niger River. And at that time is when we learned that we were going to have AFRICOM, the Africa Command, because now we're finally going to pay attention to Africa. And so we were all excited. We're going to pay attention to Africa. This is going to be a wonderful moment, so we announce it. AFRICOM's coming. And when I started talking to my Malian friends about AFRICOM, guess what the number one question they asked of me? Who are you going to invade? Who are you going to invade? That hit me between the lights, right between the running lights, like a ton of bricks. When did we become that? When did we become that person? When did we become that nation? That when they see Americans coming, they want to know who we're going to invade. So this isn't an advertisement against military power. I'm proud to be a Marine. I'll always be a Marine. And I think we need to have the strongest, most capable, most effective military the world's ever seen, and we're going to continue to have that. Because trust me, there's plenty of bad people that need to be headbutted into submission. That's what God put Marines on the ground for, all right? And that's what we're here to do. But it can't be our primary face to the rest of the world. There's a time and place for that. National security does not equate to national defense. It's part of it. National defense is part of it, but it doesn't equate to it. What national security these days is food security, water security, having a built environment that accommodates human beings and not just automobiles. That we start getting off of fossil fuels and start getting serious about renewable energy. That we start getting serious about the education of our kids to give them the skill sets that they need to thrive in a 21st century context. We are now 8th in the world in innovation dominance. We put innovation on the map. And we're giving that away just because we just won't address education in an adult fashion? That we put this false choice between our kids' education and our ability to go to Disney World? Give me a break. This is national security on steroids when we start talking about the fabric of our society. This is the place that we've got to go to. This is the place that we used to be at. And if you remember Thomas Paine, the cause of America is the cause, in a large measure, the cause of mankind. That's our obligation. It's our responsibility. Nobody else is going to do it. You think China's going to step in that place and take care of the math, the 1.5 planets worth of resources we're consuming? They're not going to do it. We've got to do it. So that's where Wayne and I got to. And so what did we end up talking about at the end of the day? Yes, raise sustainability up to be our national strategic imperative for grand strategy. And in the process of doing that, maybe we can get to a place where we do a National Prosperity and Security Act that fundamentally reframes our approach within government, as well as how do we incorporate private and civil sector resources to address these very vexing, novel, unique problems that we have in the world. This is an issue of U.S. code, U.S. authorities. We can talk about that later if you'd like. But we did it with NSA 47, National Security Act 1947. We did it then. We also did grand strategy pretty well. In World War II, we were the arsenal democracy. During the Cold War, we took on Soviet Union and global communism. We did grand strategy, and it was our economy that did it. But we asked citizens to participate in it. But for some reason nowadays, because of our ideological, we don't even have politics, we have ideologies, we're afraid to ask Americans to contribute, to put skin into the game, to put sweat equity in the game. Because God forbid we'd ever ask Americans to actually do anything anymore, because right now we've got this resident sense of entitlement instead of a citizen sense of responsibility and destiny. That's what we need to get to as Americans. And there's no single ideological answer to any of your problems. It's in your hands. If you ever read de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, that was his #1 observation, that Americans just get it on. When are we going to get it on? Are we going to wait around for someone to give us the magic answer? Well, guess what? There is no elf on a moonbeam that's going to fly down and give you the answer. We are those elves. We're sitting on the moonbeam. It's time for us to get on with it. And so what do I say as we come together as, as Americans? Now this may sound like pie in the sky, but there's no other solution to this. The ideologies that we currently see tearing our nation apart, and I can say this because I'm a Marine, I'm still apolitical, I'll always be apolitical. I do not subscribe to any political party. And I don't care if it's cash for clunkers or promises for $2 a gallon of gas. Whatever party wants to give you, right now I'm not buying it. Because either way you cut it, it's nothing more than loaves of bread being chucked up in the Coliseum to placate the mob. All right? It's time that you start facing the reality that we have got to put skin in the game, because there's a certain thing that we cannot escape as Americans, that we have to be citizens. That the purpose of the polis, as Aristotle said, was to create good citizens in pursuit of the good life. It's our responsibility. Nobody's going to give it to us. And it's in that pursuit of the good life that we will find our destiny again. We will find the cause of America. It comes down to grand strategy. Grand strategy is nothing more than philosophy. And remember what philosophy is. Philo, love. Sophos, wisdom. A love of wisdom. There's no technological answer. Remember what technology is. Techno, skill. Logos, knowledge. This is our skill and knowledge. It's important stuff. But until we have a philosophy that informs that technology, we're lost. And this, I wasn't the first one to say that. Cicero said that on Duties. He said, arms in the field are of little effect when there's no wisdom at home to guide it. There's nothing I can do, Captain has to do now, me I used to do, that I can do abroad to help you out. National security isn't defense. It's how you live your life right home and the choices that you make. So at the end of the day, am I talking about utopia? Damn straight I'm talking about utopia. Because remember what utopia, let's do another etymological drill here. There's two different ways you can spell utopia. You can spell it the OU way, OU, or EU, topos. Well, the OU, topos, topos being place, OU is no place. The EU, topos, utopia, is good place. And let's close this out right now, and we can talk more about details, because I know this has been pie in the sky, but just one last thought that our Navajo friends remind us. You can't get to a good place in a bad way. It's time to start considering what is our way. We're better than where we are right now. We're not about threat and risk. We're about opportunity. Let's start pursuing the opportunities and have the guts to move forward and make this country what the world needs right now, because our cause truly is the cause of mankind right now. Thank you.
Simplify greatly, I would summarize the arguments on either side of the free trade debate as this. For the proponents, they see free trade as a good thing because it will lead to a more sensible international division of labor. United States will be able to specialize, not just the United States, but advanced countries in Europe, Canada, elsewhere, will be able to specialize in more advanced technology-intensive products, because we will have a global market into which to sell those goods. And we will import cheaper, more labor-intensive products. Efficiency will go up, productivity will go up, costs for consumer goods will go down, and all of us will be wealthier as a result. So in a nutshell, that's the pro-argument. The argument made by the opponents is that freer trade is likely to be a bad thing for the United States, particularly when it involves countries at lesser stages of development. That what we will get is what's called a race to the bottom. So if you eliminate import tariffs on goods so you can sell from any country into any other country, then corporations are likely to locate their production facilities in places where the costs are lowest, where the protections for workers are the weakest, and where environmental standards are the lowest. And the result of that will be significant job loss for the United States and lower wages for those who remain employed. So, here we are now, basically 2 decades after this debate really got kicked off with the NAFTA. And if you listen to the debates in Washington, you hear more or less the same things. The proponents and opponents of trade are making more or less the same arguments that they made during the NAFTA and the WTO debates. Has trade been good for jobs? First, yes, for those working in the 1990s. No, for those working over the past decade. Yes, if you have at least a college education. No, if you don't. Yes, if you work in what we largely call business services industries, so financial services, software, engineering design, that whole suite of sort of high-end services. No, if you work in manufacturing. So I'll go into more detail a bit on each of these three. But I have to start with a slightly depressing caveat. It's actually a lot harder to answer a question like that than you might think. And it's because in the real world, a whole lot of things are going on simultaneously. I mean, we know that trade matters a lot more in the U.S. economy than it used to. In 1970, trade was just 10%. It's imports and exports. Trade was just 10% of the U.S. economy. It didn't have a huge impact on how well our economy did. Today, it's closer to 30%. So much bigger impact on our overall economy. But in 1970, while trade was much lower, we didn't have personal computers. The big container ships that now handle most of the trade from China and elsewhere in the world were just being developed. Much of the world, you think China, Russia, not to mention Vietnam and India, were largely closed to foreign investment, were not part of the global market. And in 1992, when I was covering NAFTA, we didn't have the internet. So sorting out the effects of trade on jobs from the effects of technology on jobs is really hard. I mean, my favorite line from this report, which is the ostensible reason I'm here, I was the co-project director for a big report that the Council published at the end of last year on U.S. trade and investment policy. And we had a line in there which was written by my co-director, Matt Slaughter, who's an economist at Dartmouth. And he wrote, suppose that a U.S. multinational company establishes a new affiliate in India to provide internet-enabled back-office accounting support for its U.S. operations. Would the resulting job or wage loss for the company's U.S. workers be attributed to trade, foreign investment, or technological change? The answer seems to be yes, yes, and yes. So to expand a bit on each of these categories, so the 1990s versus the 2000s. The Council on Foreign Relations, where I work, is a nonpartisan organization. This task force report was co-chaired by a Democrat, former Senate leader Tom Daschle, and a Republican, former White House Chief of Staff Andy Card. And the group was more or less evenly split between Republican-leaning former politicians, former Democratic officials, corporate leaders, union leaders, variety of experts. It was a pretty balanced group. And so I say this without any partisan flavor, and it was a conclusion we came to. The last decade has been really, really bad for U.S. workers. I mean, people sometimes ask, are we going to have a lost decade like Japan had? Well, sorry, we've already had it. The Economist just recently examined economic indicators for half a dozen countries that were hard hit by the financial crisis. The worst was Greece, where the Economist says Greece has basically lost a dozen years. Their economy has fallen back 12 years as a result of the financial crisis. Ireland, Portugal, and Spain lost 7 years each. Britain lost 8. The United States, we lost exactly a decade. You know, the number of jobs in the United States right now is roughly the same as it was in the late 1990s, and our population is much bigger. So the question now is not, are we going to have a lost decade? It's whether we're going to have 2 lost decades. If you look in the 1990s, there was robust employment growth in virtually every sector of the U.S. economy and across all education and skill levels. And trade was part of that story, with both exports and imports growing rapidly. CFR did a similar kind of thing, convened a task force on trade in 2001. It was chaired at the time by Bob Rubin, who was the former Treasury Secretary, and Ken Duberstein, who had been Reagan's chief of staff, White House chief of staff in remember his first term or second term. The project director at the time actually was a little-known guy named Tim Geithner. So maybe I have great things in my future. They wrote, which was quite plausible, writing from, this was pre-9/11, 2001, they wrote, quote, "The gains from trade are broadly shared. Throughout the last decade, as the United States has become significantly more open, U.S. employment and wages have increased. That was true for that decade written then. 10 years later, the opposite is true. Wages and employment have both declined, and it's not simply a feature of the recession. If you look at the period 2000 to 2009, the only people who made real wage gains in the U.S. economy were the most highly educated. So we're talking PhDs, MBAs, lawyers, and doctors. Everyone else lost ground. If you were a high school grad, your wages dropped on average by 10%. Even college grads lost 5% over the last decade. In the 2000s, companies stopped investing in the United States. We hear a lot in economic debates about the importance of small companies, but like it or not, big multinational companies are really important to the U.S. economy. They account for 60% of U.S. exports, 85% of all research and development, and they pay wages that are on average 25% higher than the U.S. economic average. Most smaller companies that are involved in trade do it as suppliers to the big companies. In the 1990s, these big companies were investing abroad and they were investing in the United States. From 1989 to 1999, U.S. headquartered multinationals created 2.7 million jobs abroad and 4.4 million jobs in the United States. So it was quite reasonable to say there was a kind of win-win going on in the 90s. Now take a look at the period from 1999 to 2009. Those same companies created another 2.4 million jobs abroad. In the United States, they eliminated 2.9 million jobs over that decade. The U.S. stopped attracting foreign investment. At the end of the 90s, more than 40% of all foreign investment was in the United States, an extraordinary figure. By 2009, that had dropped to just over 15%, which was an extraordinary plunge. So if we're going to attribute some of the job and wage gains of the 1990s to trade, it is equally reasonable to attribute some of the wage and job losses over the past decade to trade. In this decade, the big difference on the trade front has probably been China, which entered the WTO in 2001. China is a big economy with an enormous labor pool, and over the past decade, more and more of the world's manufacturing work has gravitated to China. While the percentages are still fairly small, it's enough to have had a pretty big impact. In 1991, just 3% of U.S. manufacturing imports came from low-income countries. By 2007, so just before the recession, that was 12%, and almost all of that increase was a result of imports from China. So there's no question that even as U.S. consumers have gained from low-priced and often high-quality goods, think iPads and iPhones, which are largely made in China, this has had a significant negative impact on U.S. manufacturing. The most sophisticated study I've seen by an MIT economist, University of California economist, suggests that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the job losses in U.S. manufacturing over the past decade, and that's 5 to 6 million jobs we're talking about, were due to trade with China. So big impact. My second point, trade's been good if you got at least a college education, not so good if you don't. If you live in a wealthy country, in a globalized economy, the only way to get ahead is to develop skills that distinguish you from the hundreds of millions of unskilled, poorly paid people who are more than happy to take your job. If you look from the early 70s through the early 90s, only those with college educations or better saw real wage gains in that period. That's a big period, so we're talking 25 years here. 60% of U.S. households had flat or declining wages over that period of rapid trade growth. Things got a little better, as I said, in the 90s, but then fell off a cliff over the last decade. Let's be clear here, just to back up for a second. You cannot look at those numbers and say, well, absolutely, trade has been bad for most U.S. workers. I mean, there are many other factors. There's technology at play, as I talked about. And secondly, for all of us as consumers, and we're both, we're workers and we're consumers, there have been big improvements in quality and big price declines. Most of us live in larger houses than our parents or our grandparents did. Our television sets are bigger and cheaper. We have bigger and better refrigerators. Our cars are relatively less expensive and in most cases more reliable. Economists from the Peterson Institute in Washington have said that the net gains from globalization to an average American family are as much as $10,000. I think that number's probably a bit inflated, but even if it's half that, that's a big number. But almost all of that is on the consumer side. That's a gain that has come from paying less for the goods that we buy in stores. Those are not gains on the wage side. So let me take the last point I made here, which was trade has been a reasonably good thing if you're working in a business services related industry, not so good if you're in manufacturing. It matters a lot in assessing the impact of trade on jobs, which sector you work in. My colleague Michael Spence, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist, the former dean of the Stanford Business School, published last spring, and you can find it on the CFR website, what I think is one of the most important studies produced to date on the issue of trade and jobs. He basically looked at the entire U.S. economy from 1990 to 2008 and divided it up into tradable and non-tradable sectors, which is harder to do than you might think. I mean, some things are obviously tradable. You know, if you're selling cars or you're selling corn, you know, these are things that that are readily tradable. Things like X-ray readings or architectural drawings get more confusing. There's a lot more of the economy now that, due to the internet, is tradable. But anyway, he divided the economy up, tradable, non-tradable, and his conclusion was troubling. He found that virtually all of the jobs growth in the United States over that period came from the non-tradable sectors, so especially government, health services, and before the crash, construction. It was basically no job growth at all in the tradable sectors. And this is worrying for a number of reasons. The tradable sectors are highly productive. Manufacturing in the United States has become enormously more efficient, with computerized machinery doing much of the work that was once done by employees. In comparison, productivity gains in healthcare, government, or basic service jobs like restaurants and tourism are tiny. I mean, the output of our government, our healthcare system doesn't improve markedly from one year to the next. Manufacturing, those improvements have been enormous. So we're ending up with an economy in which a smaller number of people are working in higher wage, higher productivity industries, and a far greater number are working in lower wage, lower productivity service industries. So manufacturing is important for a whole bunch of reasons we can talk about in the Q&A. There are some positive signs of a slight manufacturing recovery, which is important for a state like Wisconsin. It's why President Obama came to the Master Lock plant here a couple of weeks ago. But generally, you know, the story over the last decade has been a pretty depressing one for manufacturing. The big gains in trade for the United States have come in these tradable service sectors, like financial services, software, publishing, telecommunications, higher education, interestingly, which is a tradable service, some health services. The United States actually runs a big trade surplus in services. Last year, our services surplus was $179 billion, which was a record, compared with a deficit in traded goods, which was $737 billion, which sadly is not a record. So what do we do about this? If you look at the full story in the debate between the opponents and the proponents of freer trade, I would conclude, looking back at the last 2 decades, that each was partly right and partly wrong. I mean, the proponents were right in that there were overall benefits to the economy in terms of improved productivity, falling consumer prices, some of the things they predicted. The opponents were also right that there has been a kind of race to the bottom, especially with respect to jobs and wages for manufacturing workers. So, you know, what's the best response to this? I suppose one response could be to say, stop. You know, we want to get off. This is a game that we're not doing tremendously well in. Why do we want to keep playing? But I don't think, for better or worse, there's any plausible way to do that. The United States has spent much of the last half century trying to persuade the rest of the world of the virtues of capitalism. And guess what? They listened to us. They believed us. And now they're out there trying to outcompete us. And our only choice is to respond by becoming more competitive. And here I'm actually quite critical of U.S. government policy. The U.S. approach to international trade over this period that I've been following for many years was basically to negotiate these agreements that lowered tariffs and eliminated other trade barriers. And the unspoken assumption was that this would be good for Americans because, after all, we were the most competitive economy with the best companies and the best workforce. Well, a lot of other countries didn't take that for granted. The Germans, the Canadians, when they entered into the free trade agreement with the United States in the late 1980s, the Chinese, others, spent a lot of time thinking about how to succeed in this new world, about how to become successful trading nations. And what we argued in this report is that that's what the United States needs now. We need to become a much more successful trading nation. You know, we need a trade negotiating agenda that plays to our competitive strengths. We need enforcement of trade agreements in ways that prevent harm to U.S. companies and stop unfair trade practices by foreign countries. We need a national investment initiative that seriously tries to attract expanding foreign investment to the United States, because that's something we've been losing out on. And we need a much more sophisticated social safety net and worker retraining program, because the programs we have were designed 60, 70, 80 years ago and don't speak to the realities of a modern competitive global economy.